And now, right to your hosts of Down the Garden Path, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing.
Hello and welcome to Down the Garden Path, where we discuss down-to-earth tips and advice while doing our best to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape. I'm Joanne Shaw, owner of Down2Earth Landscape Design, and with me is my co-host and co-author, Matthew Dressing. Welcome, Matthew.
Good evening, Joanne, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matthew Dressing, owner of Natural Affinity Garden Design. As landscape designers and gardeners, we believe it's important and possible to have great gardens which are sustainable and low maintenance, and we want to help you make it happen.
That's right, and it's the last day of the month, or last Monday of the month, or our last show of the month, and we are rounding out the month talking about native plants, and we are joined by Anna Fialkoff from Wild Seed Project. So if you have a question about native plants, please share it with us at downthegardenpathpodcast@hotmail.com. And I'm sure that we would love to hear more about what you're wondering about as far as native plants. It's kind of the hot topic these days. I'd love to introduce you to Anna, and she'll tell us a little bit about her. So welcome to the show, Anna.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so a little bit about me. I'm the Ecological Programs Manager for Wild Seed Project. And I've been here working with Wild Seed Project for about 2 years now. Before I was at Wild Seed Project, I actually was working in Massachusetts at Native Plant Trust's botanical garden called Garden in the Woods. And I was a horticulturist there for 6 years. So as the Ecological Programs Manager, I actually do a number of things at Wild Seed Project, including working with partners, including nonprofits and for-profits, land trusts, et cetera, on creating demonstration projects to show people what rewilding with native plants can look like, incorporating them into their landscapes in public and private areas alike. And then I also teach walks, talks, and workshops for Wild Seed Project and work on our annual publication, which is in the form of a guide for the last 2 years.
Wow, so you have your hands full.
Definitely.
That is great. Well, I love that. And I like the walks and talks. That's a good way for people to learn. So in your career, how do you feel like, because, you said like 8 years ago when you got your last job, I mean, native plants, I don't know that they really were in the forefront, but I'm sure you've seen things really change in the last 8 years.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I've been working with native plants for even longer than that. I actually I worked at Project Native, which is no longer actually a nonprofit anymore, but it was in Housatonic, Massachusetts. And so there have been people, advocating for native plants throughout New England for quite a while, but in Massachusetts, definitely for probably a little longer than Maine. Native Plant Trust was an organization started in the early 1900s, actually. So it's a really old organization, but Wild Seed Project is relatively new and young, but we're growing pretty quickly. We're in our 8th year now. And I think even since it was started by our founder, Heather McCargo, there's just been so much more buildup of awareness of native plants and people really trying to look for sources for native plants. So more and more nurseries are opening up, but that is still trying to kind of meet the demand that now that all the educational resources people are finding, there's still too high of a demand for the amount of native plants out there available for people, which I guess that's not a horrible thing for the native plant folks. We sell seeds of native plants at Wild Seed Project. So that allows for people to get their hands on the native seeds, much lower cost than it would take to buy a plant. And they can feel empowered to grow them themselves, which is really exciting.
Excellent. Well, do you want to tell us, you told us a little bit, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about Wild Seed Project and what you do there, or what the project does.
For sure. Yeah. Wild Seed Project is a nonprofit that's really dedicated to inspiring people to take action and plant native species where they live, work, and play, and equipping our communities with the tools they need to do that. So we're really, trying to work at the community level and build a movement around native plants and make people feel like they have, the plants to actually do this, the skills and knowledge about what it means to plant them in the landscape and keep them thriving. And also just so that people can learn more about all the cascade of benefits that native plants have once you put them in the ground.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so I could add on to that so what we do in effect is we sell seeds of native plants, like I mentioned earlier, and we do lots of educational programs like those walks, talks, and workshops, and put out an annual publication so that people can find those resources on a number of different levels. And, like I mentioned earlier too, really showcase through demonstration projects what it can mean to plant native species in people's yards and parks and gardens, even their front stoops or in a container on their deck.
Very cool. I have a question about the seeds. So just for those who are listening, I believe you can get a lot of your seeds from wildseedproject.net. You guys have a shop with some cool merch and a lot of the seeds there. Are they harder to start than, the average seed that you're going to find in the big box store or your local garden center? Is there anything special that we need to do versus these other ornamentals that we purchased from seed and start from seed?
That's a really good question. I actually think it's actually probably easier in my mind to grow a native plant from seed than it is a tender perennial or garden vegetable, because you don't have to do as much coddling to the native plants as you would to, keep the tender perennials and vegetables warm and start them in spring. With native plants, you actually can sow them in a pot in some soil outside in the late fall and early winter. So mid-November through January is kind of the ideal time. And some native plants can go a little later than that, some a little earlier, but generally they need that kind of cold exposure to the elements, the rain, the snow, freezing, thawing, in order to break their dormancy. So the seeds, if you sow them at the appropriate time in the late fall to early winter, then most of them will germinate by the next spring. There's a few seeds that a few species that might take 2 years because they're used to just sitting in the soil for a couple years and going through 2 sets of years of all of going through all the elements before they germinate. But for the most part, it's pretty easy. And once they germinate or sprout in the spring, you just need to make sure that they don't dry out. So just watering them, but leaving them outside is actually the best thing. And you don't need a greenhouse. You don't need to start them indoors or put them in the refrigerator for a period of time. It's actually really simple and straightforward.
Wonderful. That's great, eh?
Yeah, that's super, super easy. And so just again, because I'm going with that coupling of I'm starting seeds, do you need any special soil? You say we can kind of plant them outside. If we're not planting them in the garden, if we're starting them in a container, do we use just kind of that peat-based kind of mix, or do we want to use more of our native soil, just our ground soil?
I would say use a potting mix that's rich in compost. And just an organic potting soil would be great. That's standard potting soil. And you don't need anything special. If you can go peat free, that's great because peat has a lot of environmental consequences. But I think, hopefully over time we'll have more and more options for peat free soil mixes, but any sort of regular potting soil mix is just fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a whole episode, isn't it, to talk about the peat issue. And I'm actually surprised it's taken this long, because I've been in the industry a long time and I feel like we've been talking about it it for a long time, and people still ask, where can I find a big bag of, so yeah. So I think that one has been one that's a little slow to change, but that is great. And so it's really good to know that we can just sow them outside. Our climate, so you're in Maine now, so zone wise, zone 5.
Yeah, we're 6A.
Okay.
So where I am in southern Maine. And yeah, I think even further south, you can do that. I think I would say start your seeds maybe in January, so that that they're going to you're not going to have too much warm up before they get started. It can vary a little bit by your region. So for the Northeast, generally, that's the best thing to do for our native seeds.
Okay, because we're 5B, right, Matt? So
I think so. 5B. For 5B, yeah.
Yeah. Now, if there's snow on the ground, so if you say January, I mean, typically there hasn't been really snow on the ground in January, but if there's snow, is that okay? Or are we pushing the snow aside and then sprinkling seeds?
Yeah, well, you can actually, I like to actually do the seed sowing itself in my kitchen or kitchen table or something like that. So you can bring your pots inside and you don't have to have cold fingers while you're doing it. Do your potting soil, smush it down in like a 4.5-inch pot, something like that. And make sure it's nice and compact. Then you take just a packet of our seeds. So you usually have 50 to 100 seeds in the packet, depending on the species. And you just sprinkle the whole packet in, because if you sow the seeds thickly, our founder, Heather McCargo, likes to say seeds are like teenagers and they like to stay together. So sow them thickly, actually, which is different from what you're taught for vegetables too. You don't need to space them a certain amount apart. And then you'll get like a bunch of little seedlings that will sprout up in the spring in the container, and you can divide them after that. Okay. But so for continuing this with the seed sowing instructions, after you sow them on top of the soil, you just kind of let them sit there, and you actually put a little bit of sand on top, about to the thickness of the seed. So for like a dust-like seed, like lobelia, I would do probably even no sand. And for something like a lupin, which is kind of the size of a pea, I would do about a 1/4 inch of sand. Okay. That's partly to keep the seeds from kind of splashing out during heavy rains, because that is something that happens more and more these days with the downpours that we get. And then you can put them outside and protect them with some rodent cloth, like 1/4 inch hardware cloth. That's what I use. Just making sure the creatures don't, rummage through and eat them. And then just leave them there all through the winter. Make sure that they're exposed to the elements. So don't put them under an eave or porch or anything like that. And you don't have to add water to them or anything like that at the beginning during the winter. You just let them be.
Nice.
That is
Very
good.
cool.
Much easier than starting tomato plants.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh. So tell us more about, just kind of going around on the website wildseedproject.net for those of you who want to log on and follow along. Tell us about your pledge to rewild. What does this pledge to rewild mean?
The Pledge to Rewild is an initiative we started in 2020, late 2020. It's a movement that we wanted to build around helping people find the tools, the easiest path towards planting native species and doing it in a holistic way. So we think of rewilding as having kind of these 3 tenets. And the first for us, and I just have to preface this with, rewilding has multiple definitions. So our definition of rewilding is that native plants are the foundations of our local food webs. And we are really thinking of the plants as those kind of keystone species that help kind of keep the whole ecosystem in balance. Keep everybody fed. So the 3 tenets of rewilding are a more holistic approach in which, yes, the first one is planting native species is extremely important because they are the foundation of our local food webs. And second, thinking about changing our kind of harmful habits like mowing and blowing and using pesticides and fertilizers to more mindful practices that support the planet's health and ecosystems overall, and allow for all the different creatures to kind of complete their full life cycles. So leaving your leaves when they fall on the ground, not cutting everything back, leaving some for the bees for nesting spots, all sorts of things like that. So those management practices everything that you do when you're gardening, a lot of that is unlearning horticulture, unlearning gardening. And then the third tenet of rewilding is really just thinking about the people side of things, building a movement, and thinking about all of our yards and our public spaces, any plantable area, as part of a habitat corridor that allows butterflies and birds and other creatures to move through, so that you're creating critical mass of area for all of these creatures to find the native plants that they forage off of. So a lot of our habitats, of course, have been fragmented by development, and I think we can band together and join as communities to make this a real movement where we think strategically about how to rewild. We can't do it in a vacuum. So that's basically what rewilding is. And when people take our pledge to rewild, they get put on this map of, your property or your site gets to be put on a rewilding map. So you get to see, your greater impact in the landscape. And then you get emailed all sorts of really great tools and guidance in the form of 10 actionable steps that you can take to rewild your own site. So that might not be your personal property. It might be, or it could be a public park near you, a community garden. It could even be, like I mentioned earlier, your front porch, if that's what you have, to plant native species in pots, and then get involved with different community efforts. So that's rewilding in a nutshell.
Okay, that's great. And who do you see as who is do you have a focus or a more popular? I mean, is it public spaces or cities and municipalities, like local? Are you seeing that? Because homeowners, I mean, I feel like we are just like a drop in the bucket, and we really need communities, bigger government communities, to buy into that.
Oh yeah, I think we're kind of thinking this as everyone and anyone. That's why we have demonstration projects that we're working towards. So some of our projects in the future might be a retirement community that's deciding to kind of think about all the buildings and the grounds in their area and how they can change their maintenance regimen and plant native species instead of kind of the typical box stored plants that you get, like the boxwoods and the lilacs. So that's actually, one facet. So thinking about that from that community level, individuals in their own homes, of course. And we know that not everybody owns property too. So I think participating in your community to do this is just as important as if you have your own backyard to plant native species.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so it's so funny you mentioned boxwood, because I had a contractor say to me today, so if you have any jobs that need a lot of boxwood, I just got a good deal on 1,000 of them. And I'm like, oh, good. The plant that all designers are trying to plant less of, because there's 35 insects that feed off of them and no other reason to plant them. And he goes, yeah, I'm guessing that's probably why I got them for such a cheap price. So I thought that was kind of funny. So I'm like, yeah, there he's thinking, oh, this is it. He goes, it was an impulsive emotional decision. And I said, yeah, there's a reason why those were a good deal, is because I think as the industry, we're finally, it's hard to get away from them because they do have, a structure, homeowners love them, but, we're trying to get away from them. So that was kind of a funny conversation I just had today,
It's actually, that happens quite a bit, is, it's the plant they're trying to get rid of that they give you a special deal. I think there's a town I will not mention the name of that planted a ton of Bradford pears because of a deal just like that. And Bradford pears are an invasive species, and they're a commonly planted street tree. I'm not really sure why, because they don't smell very good. Their branches break. And there's so many other species that could support more moths and butterflies and pollinators and things like that. So, I think that sometimes it's just people don't know what other options they have, and that there are other sources for plants and more interesting plants. So like instead of a boxwood, you could plant an inkberry holly, which I really like, and support a lot of different wildlife through that. It's evergreen too, so it provides really dense cover for birds during the winter, the ones that are not migrating.
So you've mentioned all of these different resources. So where is it, are all these resources and all these tools just on wildseedproject.net?
Yeah, you can find a lot there. Our website is definitely has a very rich library of resources, including where to buy native plants, nurseries that we, have researched, as well as gives plant lists and plant designs for different situations. And we have a lot of different articles on all things native plants, not just seed sowing and growing, though we have a lot on that too. But I think if you take the Pledge to Rewild, it kind of funnels you through all those resources in a more digestible way. So I definitely encourage folks, if they're just getting started with native plants, to take the Pledge to Rewild, because that's a really good kind of starting set of resources. And it will provide links to articles and on our website and off of our website, and different how-to resources for how to start thinking about all these things.
Okay.
Very
And I'm
cool.
looking at your Facebook page as well, and there's a lot of good, really good information. I was just looking at, you're offering an intro to designing with native plants, which I think was, have we missed it, or is it coming up?
That
was in June.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot of the classes that we have, we do teach multiple times a year or year after year. And we always have new classes that we, bring on too, because we're always trying to keep ourselves refreshed and excited and interested at the same time as teaching the things that are the stalwart pieces that I think everyone wants to know more about designing with native plants. I think that can be one of the trickiest things. It's the biggest obstacle to people actually getting started, because I think you don't see a lot of examples for out there for how to plant natives in a way that's aesthetically pleasing, and not kind of eventually going to become a little bit messy looking. But there's actually a lot of good tips and tricks in that class, as well as other classes that we teach for how to think about bringing in those cues to care for that make a landscape look a lot more intentional.
That's a good point, because I think as a landscape designer myself, I've taken some, native plant courses, and, the speaker will like show what they consider a design or a finished, native garden. And I'm like, oh my God, it's the ditch. Like no one, honestly, no one wants that in their front yard. So I know all the reasons, and all the benefits, all of that, I understand it, but I'm dealing with a client who wants a beautiful, front yard, backyard, that type of thing. And unfortunately they low maintenance, which I know there's a native part to that they are no low maintenance, because they do also need less, even as plants, right, need less coddling than some of our non-natives. But I still feel like if it does look too messy or too unintentional, so, and I can remember like looking at the audience, like watching like all the faces, right, when I'm like, yeah, we're all going like, no, what? Right? So, you can say, yes, that's native, and yes, it's good for habitat. But then I feel like people are like, well, that's okay if it's over there, but I don't want that in my front yard or backyard.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. If you have strategies for homeowners and designers to help, for us to help our clients.
Yeah, I think that's definitely also a big obstacle to getting people on board with using native plants in their landscape. I think like there's so many pieces of that I think you could take to kind of help with people who are new to this, who are not quite fully sold, especially on the aesthetics of it. Like thinking about, there definitely are certain native species that are a little bit more gardeny than others, like the clump forming ones. And I think there's an argument that, a lot of the native plant kind of purists will go for, you don't want to plant any cultivars because they're not as great for wildlife. They're cloned, so they don't have genetic diversity. And that's true, but I think you can find some middle ground where maybe you have, if you do include some cultivars in your design, you can also have, maybe if you do have room, you could have the native natural species, maybe in a more naturalized part of your yard or something like that. Or, sometimes just going for the more dwarfed cultivars is a good way to go. The ones where the fruits and the flowers and the leaf color is all consistent with the natural species. That ensures that, the plant is more likely to be good for wildlife than if those pieces are changed, because you don't know how that's going to make the plant as, more or less desirable for wildlife that feed on it if it has a different color than the natural species, or the fruits enlarged, maybe it may have less nectar, less sugars in it, or the flower might have less nectar content. So there's definitely things that you can pay attention to and select your, nativars wisely. But I think creating nice edges in the garden is a nice thing to do as well. Sometimes mowing an edge, a really crisp edge around a backyard meadow is a good idea, so that you can see that it's not just kind of raggedy at the edges, and the plants aren't just kind of like falling over. So there's a number of different things that you can do to make the space look more intentional. And I think it's just giving people the tools, some of those ideas that are going to help them to do that. I think no matter what, you're going to have to accept a slightly different aesthetic with a native plant garden from a regular ornamental garden. You can have more formal native plant gardens for sure. But I think for the average person who's putting in their own garden, it's still going to have, pieces that are just that you have to get used to. Like if you leave some of your stems up for native bees to find a place to nest for the winter, then I think it is going to look a little different from somebody's garden who's been cutting everything back to the ground.
Yes, who put it to bed, man. We've done multiple shows every fall about that, putting the garden to bed, But I did want to go back to the nativars when you mentioned dwarf. Do you have some examples of some that you recommend that are kind of smaller that that our listeners might be able to use, and I might be able to use in my garden?
I think, I don't know if I don't have the research on whether these particular cultivars are as good as the natural species, but I do know that, inkberry, holly, shamrock, it doesn't get as tall as the natural species. So it might get more like 3 to 4 feet rather than, the, 6 to 8 feet that the natural species gets. It's a bit more compact. And that might be great for a smaller space, or if you are really trying to mimic a boxwood kind of alternative, a really low hang to that really structural plant in the garden that's going to have year-round interest. Another holly, actually, the winterberry holly. Red Sprite is one that it's used as a compact cultivar as well. There are other cultivars that, I would be careful if you notice that your plant is keeping its berries throughout the whole winter and the birds are not eating it, because that means, it might be pleasing to us, but that does mean that the birds are not finding it very nutritious or tasty. And I would rather have my birds eat the berries than, see them all winter long. So usually if the squirrels haven't eaten them earlier on, then the birds tend to wait until they go through some freeze and thaw, and the sugars tend to concentrate in the berries. And also when there's not much else that's left, the winterberry doesn't have the sweetest berries. So I think birds tend to leave them for kind of late winter forage. So those are things to pay attention to if you do have cultivars in your landscape. Is wildlife utilizing them? Are there pollinators on them? Are there birds eating berries? Are there insects on the leaves? And there's still a lot that we need to learn about some cultivars. and, maybe how much nectar content their flowers might have versus the natural species. So, or, the nutritional value of that nectar. There have been some studies that have come out of Mount Cuba Center and graduate students that have done studies there, as well as Annie White at the University of Vermont. And so I don't know if you've had her on your podcast at any point, but
no, but I'd love
to. Yeah. So those are some really great folks to follow when learning more about native cultivars or nativars.
Very cool. Well, as we round to the bottom of the hour, I will jump in and do our little segue. I see there are some questions popping in and some people joining us. So I'm going to just stop and say thank you for joining us here live on Reality Radio 101. I'm Matthew Dressing here with my co-host and co-author, Joanne Shaw, and you're listening to Down the Garden Path. Joanne and I enjoy hosting Down the Garden Path each week, bringing you interesting and relevant topics to help you achieve a great garden. We learn right along with you from our research and from the wonderful guests that join us on the show, such as Anna, I'm going to totally say you're wrong, Fialkoff. Sorry, Anna Fialkoff.
Yeah, you got that.
There we go. From wildseedproject.net, we're talking all about native plants, and Anna is packed with information, wonderful information. So make sure you stay tuned. Don't forget, you can spend more time with us down the garden path. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. At Down the Garden Path Podcast is our handle there. You can also find us on your favorite podcast provider. And while you're there, please hit that subscribe button to be notified of new content. And please don't forget to like, share, and leave us a comment. We always love hearing from our listeners. If you guys have questions after the show or comments you'd like us to pass on to Anna, you can reach us and we will forward them to you. So you can always write us directly at downthegardenpathpodcast@hotmail.com. And you can always check out our websites as well. Joanne at www.down2earth.ca and myself at www.naturalaffinity.ca. So for those of you who are just joining us, we are talking with Anna Fialkoff from Wild Seed Project. So check out wildseedproject.net while we're on the topic of finding people online, and lots of different stuff there. And so we have a few comments and questions. Rita wrote in a little earlier saying, hi, Joanne and Matt, very interesting show tonight. So I think a lot of people are very interested in native plants. They seem to be a little quiet, so that usually means they're taking notes and listening very intently. Adam wrote in, and I think we touched on it a bit as well, but maybe Anna, if you want to maybe just quickly reiterate. Adam says, hello, what is the best way to grow natives from seeds? Thank you.
So the best way to grow natives from seeds, it's actually, most of our native seeds require a winter cold and moist period in order to break their dormancy or their hard seed coats and germinate the following spring. So that means that a lot of them like to be sown in the late fall to early winter. So mid-November through January is kind of ideal for most of them. There's some exceptions to that, but you're most likely to get some good native seedlings in the spring if you sow your native seeds then. So you just put them in on top of some well-packed garden potting soil in a container, and you can sow them thickly. So lots of different seeds together. Seeds are like teenagers. They like to be together. That's a good thing to remember. And then put them outside in an exposed area where it's going to be exposed to some sun and wind and rain and snow and freezing and thawing, and get all the elements exposed. And make sure to put some rodent cover on top. So I like to put some hardware cloth with 1/4-inch holes on top and weigh it down with a brick or a rock, and just let it be for the winter, and watch your seedlings as they come up in maybe late March or into April. Sometimes people don't even get germination till May. So don't fret if it doesn't germinate until May, depending on where you are. And, you know, it was a cool year this year. So some of my seedlings didn't come up till May, actually. And then you just need to make sure that they don't dry out. So tuck them into a place that's a little shady for the remainder of the growing season, and make sure to water them when they start to look a little dry, and watch them grow. Eventually you'll be able to divide them and plant them into bigger pots. And then I like to plant them in the fall into the ground if they're big enough. Otherwise I can let them overwinter and plant them the following year.
Excellent. Do you suggest like when you're talking about putting them in the plant, sorry, Matt, do you like leaving them in a pot above ground, or are we putting them in, like we digging a hole in the ground and like setting the pots in the ground?
You can actually set the pots right on top of the ground.
Oh, okay.
So, okay. Yeah. You could put them on your deck as long as it doesn't have an overhang, because you don't want anything covering up the rain that would hit them. You want that rain and snow to hit them.
So that really is easy, isn't it? Like if we don't have to baby them. So that's great. Yeah. So Adam, I hope that helps. Yeah. So that is great. Are there particular, like, what's your favorite one to grow that way? Or what are people most likely to get the best success? Let's just give everybody a big, you know.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
Well, I think most people don't get through a conversation about plants with me unless we talk about partridge pea, which is one of my favorite native plants.
Really?
It's an annual plant that we actually have a lot of perennials in our native plant palette, but partridge pea is actually an annual in the pea family, of course, as its name describes. And you can sow that in the fall as well. And then let that germinate in the spring. And since it's an annual, it will actually grow to maturity and flower and go to seed all in the same growing season, all in one growing season. And if you plant it in an area that has some exposed open soil and let it seed in, then it'll come back the next year. Okay. It'll be different individual plants, but you'll get partridge pea kind of coming back year after year if you have some open exposed soil. But that's a great plant because for so many reasons, because it will really, like if you plant a lot of seeds, it'll create a real ground cover even the first year. And I like to think of it as a native cover crop. So a lot of people will use it to help establish new meadows. I learned that from Daryl Morrison, who's a designer of meadows and prairies, and has done a lot of great designs for different public gardens throughout the US. And he always uses partridge pea to start his meadow. So you can even sow that one directly into the ground. You don't have to just sow that one in the pot. I think for most our native plants, you do want to sow them into a pot or a prepared kind of raised bed of sorts, because if you sow them directly onto the ground and just kind of scatter them out, then you're going to have a lot less likelihood that most of those seeds will actually germinate and grow to mature plants. You know, a lot of them are going to get washed away by rain, eaten by birds or other animals, or just not find themselves in the right spot with maybe not an, you know,
we step on them, right? Like then now, when you're gardening or you're doing something, you're stepping on them and things like that. Okay.
Weed
them out. Yeah. Yeah.
And so just the partridge pea, is it Cami Christa fasciculata? Do you know the Latin name? Okay. Yeah, I just quickly Googled it because I'd never heard of it, and it's absolutely stunning. I've got a few pictures where it's just made, this nice little ground cover, or this nice mounded, rounded, full flower. Absolutely. Like I would stop to look if it was in a normal garden and wonder what is that beautiful shrub. Like it's
not only stunning, it actually is like a pollinator magnet. And it can really add a lot of wildlife value to a newly establishing garden because it has its flowers, which provide pollen for pollinators, bumblebees and moths and butterflies, all sorts of creatures. But then it also has these little things at the base of the petiole, which is where the leaf connects to the stem. And they're called extrafloral nectaries. They look like a tiny little cup that's red, and you can see if you look really closely, it has a little dot of nectar inside. And there will be ants all over those, beetles, other pollinators that will are attracted by the beautiful bright flowers, the yellow flowers, and then they'll kind of see that there's nectar and go to those extra floral nectaries to keep foraging. And this is interesting because I think ants often have a relationship with a lot of plants where if the plant offers something else to the ant, it will kind of in exchange protect the plant from herbivory by other insects and even things like deer and mammals. So because ants put out lots of different interesting chemicals as well. So this is a good relationship for partridge pea as well. And it's actually, there've been studies on it where it's been showing promise to be kind of a trap crop for if you grow it near an agricultural area, it could potentially bring in some really good beneficial insects that will also lure in the pesty insects and eat those, kind of predate those pesty insects. So it's really great all around to plant near your garden, your vegetable garden, or in a newly establishing meadow. So I'll stop talking about partridge because I could go on forever about it.
Oh, that's great. It sounds like it could do its own show. So we might have to have you back, right? We'll talk about the whole show. So that is good. It's yellow, which that creates a dilemma for me, this like anti-yellow flower growth. But that's a whole other show too. So that's okay. It sounds like the benefit might be worth it. But that's great. So yeah, but I think it's important to give everybody something that's easy to grow and that they see it success, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. So Matt, there's a few more questions.
There is, yeah. So Shane has also written in, hello, Joanne, Matt, and Anna. Where are native plants sold? So Shane's wondering, where can he pick these natives up?
Yeah, so our native seeds are sold on our website. So you can go to our online store, wildseedproject.net, and just search for seeds and you'll find it. And we offer over 75 species of native wildflowers, shrubs, ferns, and perennials. And then you can also learn more about other places to find native plants by searching where to buy native plants on our website. And we have a list of nurseries where you can find plants in different, by state. So we have a lot for Maine because that's where we are. And then we have other New England states on there, as well as some states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, because there's some really great nurseries in some of those areas too.
Nice. And you also sell the partridge pea seeds, I see, as well on your website.
Yes.
For those who are out there, for sure. And then we do have, hi, Joanne and Matt, just tuned in. Is there anything here in Canada like the Wild Seed Project? I think your guest is from the States. Thanks. And yes, they are. And Anna, I'd have to send that to you. Is there something like the Rewild Seed Project or the Wild Seed Project up here in Canada that you know about?
I wish I was more aware of what's going on in Canada. Unfortunately, I don't know as much about that. I think you can look for a native plant society almost anywhere you are. Mm-hmm. There should be one at least. But I do know that, even in Maine versus Massachusetts, it seems like the more rural you go, the less likely there is to be as much of a native plant movement. It seems to be concentrated more around highly populated areas. So maybe some of the cities in Canada might have some, or like their surrounding metro areas might have some native plant societies.
Okay, I can speak to that too, Matt. The David Suzuki. So there's a Butterfly Way project. So that is a foundation. I know I'm part of it, kind of trying to learn more about it. So I did sign up. I got the little sign and the t-shirt, but I'm trying to learn more about it. But that is something that you can Google for Canada. So the David Suzuki Foundation, and you can register for the Butterfly Way project. And sounds similar, like we're trying to make corridors. They're trying to encourage neighborhoods to have at least 12 gardens, butterfly-friendly gardens, pollinator gardens, and that they feel like once you've got 12 in a close proximity, and then tacking them on, and that becomes kind of a corridor. So some of the things you were saying earlier on in the show that our listeners can listen back to if they joined in late, sound very similar. So that's good to know that there are, and you're right. I think the big cities and communities, there's lots of different organizations out there. And garden centers, most garden centers are trying to keep up with having native plants. The challenge there is often on the shelves. Native plants in the pot in the spring don't look that great and don't look like much, and are often expensive. So starting from seed, I'm so excited about that, and to learn that they're more effective that way. But I think it's something that it's an educational choice, and you've got to realize, like, okay, they might not look great right now, but they will look good, so they're very different from cultivars and hybrids and things that, everything on the shelf is showy and pretty. Native plants kind of take a little while, right, to fill in and to show off. Yeah. So that's something so I'll keep, my 2 cents on that side for everybody. So, but garden centers are trying to have that, and there is, getting them ready, and the volume, I think the demand is coming, and trying to keep up. And there are some native plant only, I'm sure in the US as well as Canada, nurseries, but it's also keeping up with the demand, because communities are starting, like the cities and the provinces are trying, and the states are trying to also buy from those same nurseries, right, for these projects. So there is a lot of demand, and commercial projects or more parks projects there, and they're the design might have like 1,000 plants, right? So then when we want 5, there's not enough.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'd say if you want to start a native plant nursery, this is the time to do it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, Frank, and just before we move on, I did want to just say too that I've used before, and I don't know where you are, Frank, but we're in Ontario. So onplants.ca is an Ontario native plants website, as well as nativeplants.ca is a native plants, perennials, shrubs, and grasses area near Joanne and I. So yeah, thank you very much for the question. And we'll put all these websites as well just in our show notes, so that everybody listening, if you're listening to the podcast or live right now, you can find all the links, especially to the Wild Seed Project that we've got Anna Fialkoff on here from us, if you're just joining us. And Anna, we have another question for you. Bill has written in, hello down the garden path. You talked about butterflies at the beginning of your show. Besides milkweeds, what else can we use or do to attract them and help them? I love them. Thank you, Bill. So do you have maybe some of your other favorite natives or other really strong butterfly and or native moth plants that we could be planting as well?
Yeah, I really like this question because of course, any native plant with with showy flowers is going to be a butterfly magnet. The mountain mints, the bee balms, cone flowers, like echinacea, and other native perennials that you'll find in a sunny kind of meadow-like setting. However, you can also plant native trees and shrubs to attract moths and butterflies. Doug Tellamy, who's an entomologist at the University of Delaware, has done a lot of research on this and found that there's actually 5 significant genera of native trees that support the most moths and butterflies, because during not just the adult part of their life cycle, when they need to forage on nectar from flowers, they also have to be able to eat during their caterpillar stages, and they feed on the leaves of a lot of our native trees and shrubs, and perennials, of course, too. But if you plant oaks actually are the single biggest supporter of moths and butterflies and other insects than any other genre. So any species of native oak, I wouldn't plant the English oak to get as many of those species near you, but planting those native trees. Cherries is another one. So cherries and plums kind of are paired together. You could plant a beach plum if you don't have a really good size area for a canopy tree. And willows are another one. You could do a willow shrub like a pussy willow. You don't have to do a big black willow tree. Poplars and birches, as well as maples and other species. But those are the top 5, the oaks, cherries, willows, poplars, and birches.
Excellent. That is great. Great question. And trees, I think that's really important. And for designers and for homeowners, I mean, that's often a big question. You know, how I mean, red oaks here in Ontario are very popular. You know, you need the space, though that can sometimes be the challenge. So it's great that you mentioned like a pussy willow, and that's something that would be easy to include in people's design, wouldn't it, Matt?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, pussy willows, I mean, if you have a rain garden, they'd be great for something like that. I think you need a little bit more moisture for them. And there's other, you know, shrubs that host a lot of different wildlife as well, including those moths and butterflies. Like native viburnums are one of our greatest groups of plants.
One of my favorite plants.
Maple leaf viburnum for the shade, or a smooth arrowwood for a wet spot, or you could do viburnum nudum, the smooth witherrod, for kind of an average garden soil in full sun, and it gets incredible fall foliage too. So there's a lot of beautiful plants that are also wildlife magnets, and it's not just those perennials with the flowers. Those are really important too, but even more significant are a lot of our woody plants, and you can find trees and shrubs of varying sizes that can fit in a variety of different landscapes.
Yeah, perfect.
Beautiful.
Perfect. I would love to talk about ground covers, because that's an easy one for people, right? Because everybody needs a ground cover. Do you have some that you recommend, or do you want to talk a little bit about native ground cover in the couple of minutes we have left, right, Gary?
Sure thing. Yeah, we actually have a publication we put out every year, and the last 2 years it's been a guide. So our first publication last year that was a guide was the Native Trees for Northeast Landscapes, and that talked about 31 species of trees of different sizes that you can plant in your landscape. And then we came out this year with native ground covers for Northeast landscapes, and that publication goes out free to all our members, and then you can also buy it on our website, wildseaproject.net. But yeah, native ground covers are just incredible because they will be the workhorses in the landscape that really cover the ground and make sure that, you know, your soil is not getting eroded, that you can retain moisture in your soil and suppress weeds as they come up, and, you know, really shade the ground so it cools and keeps that moisture retained. So I think one of my favorites might be golden groundsel. Or running groundsel. There's 2 different species that are really similar. And those groundsel species, Pachyra obovata or Pachyra aurea, really great species that will kind of become ground huggers and knit together, moving from their stolons, which are like runners along the ground, and really cover the ground. But then in spring, they have these daisy-like flowers that are yellow, actually, that bloom maybe about a foot off the ground. And they're really lovely kind of cheery flowers. And they can handle quite a wide range of different, you know, soil and moisture and sun conditions. So if you're not exactly sure of your conditions, I think that the groundsels are good for you because they will do moist, sunny areas, dry, shady areas, and kind of everything in between. Now I know that yellow is not necessarily the color that everybody loves. So I think another good one for, I think, a new native plant gardener who's not yet sold on the native plant aesthetic would be something like bearberry. And that is a beautiful kind of evergreen, actually a subshrub that it's on woody stems, but it has these small shiny leaves and blueberry-like flowers, and then red berries, and that lasts through the winter. And you can plant that in any sunny, dry spot and drape it over rock walls, or it can be along a stone pathway at the edge of a sidewalk. So it's a really good one for urban environments.
Excellent. Thank you.
I love that one, the barberry. I have it, or bearberry. I have it all over up at my cottage, just natively around, and it's just so wonderful. So wonderful.
That's wonderful.
So as we reach the last 3.5 minutes of the show, is there, time just keeps dwindling. Is there anything, Anna, that you would like to give a shout out to or promote or say about the Wild Seed Project before we sign off?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. I was just really grateful that you had me here tonight. Thank you so much. And definitely check out Wild Seed Project if you're interested in growing native plants. You can be new to native seed sowing and buy seeds from us and learn how to get started. And it's something that's accessible for everyone. And you can check out our different publications that we have or take a walk, talk, or workshop with us. So we just want people to feel like they're inspired to plant natives in their own backyards.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we'll have all those things in our show notes, as well as your Instagram. I know I found you on Instagram. So, and we already mentioned Facebook. So social media, there's some good that comes from it, learning. And I love the idea of the walks and talks workshop. So that is wonderful.
Thank you.
That is wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us here and spreading the word and helping demystify, because I feel like people, it's a bit of a mystery still about native plants for your average homeowner. Those of us in the industry, we've been hearing it for a while, but I think it's finally starting to trickle down beyond milkweed. And I think, thank you, Bill, for that question, right? Because the talk is, coneflower and milkweed and bees and monarch butterfly, but there are a lot of things in nature that depend on a lot of variety of plants. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us. So thank you. Make sure you're checking out wildseedproject.net. Thank you, Anna Fialkoff, for joining us here. Check out their social media as well. Everything is at Wild Seed Project. You guys are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and another one that I have missed because I've moved from the page.
Twitter,
thank you. But, I'm already shopping, and I've already pledged to rewild during the show. So I hope you guys all do too.
And I signed up for the newsletter too while we were on the show. Multitasking.
Yes.
Right?
We're so enthused. Joanne and I are already in. So thank you again so much.
The newsletter is a great first step because, you don't have to make any commitments. You can just kind of see what we're offering each month.
Perfect.
So sign up, everybody. And thank you again, everyone, for tuning in here on Down the Garden Path at Reality Radio 101. Next week is the civic holiday. It's going to be August 1st. So we are not going to be live on the air. We are going to play a repeat. And
August in the Garden.
I think it's going to be August in the Garden. So catch up next week with a repeat. You can also find it, if you can't wait till next week, you can find it on your favorite podcast provider with lots of other evergreen shows and wonderful information there. So thank you again, Anna, for joining us here on Down the Garden Path. You're live on Reality Radio 101, and we'll see all of our wonderful listeners. Thank you for tuning in. See you 2 weeks from now. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to Down the Garden Path with your host, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing, right here on Reality Radio 101.